of this forgotten war. What most Americans don't know is that we as taxpayers and our government are complicit in this tragedy by providing weapons and logistical support to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Early this month, President Joe Biden issued executive orders to stop the offensive in Yemen and froze the sale of arms to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. These are good immediate steps, but we still have a long way to go to resolve this conflict. To a large extent, the orders signed earlier this year reflect the persistent advocacy of people around the country who've been talking to members of Congress. I'm so pleased that we have people joining us from around the world today, and you're going to get a glimpse of both a perspective from activists here in the United States and from a member of Congress. Today, we have an excellent panel of experts on the war and this ensuing humanitarian crisis. Skye Fitzgerald, Dr. Aisha Juman, and Hassan El-Taib. Later in the panel, we will be joined by a special guest, Representative Adam Smith, who represents the 9th District of Washington, the state of Washington, and who also chairs the House Armed Services Committee. So let me begin by welcoming the producer, the director of this film, Skye Fitzgerald. Let me start by asking Skye a few questions about this film. So first of all, congratulations on having Hunger Wars shortlisted for an Oscar this year and for its acquisition by MTV Entertainment. What does that mean for the film, and what does it mean to you as someone who's motivated to make this documentary? What motivated you, and what's going to happen now that it's getting a more attention?
Well, in terms of the acquisition, it means a great deal. It means that Hunger Wars is now going to become available to a broad public demographic. It's going to launch on Pluto TV, owned by MTV, and that is active in 24 different countries. There's 36 million different users, and it's a free platform. So anyone who has Pluto TV on their Wi-Fi enabled television will be able to watch it in Europe, Latin America, or North America. And for me, that really gives us the opportunity to sort of like not only broaden the awareness footprint of the film and the conflict in Yemen, but also engage and catalyze many more people worldwide about what's happening in Yemen. Mm-hmm. As far as motivation goes, lots of things motivated me to make this film, but I guess if I distilled it down to one thing, it was anger. Anger that, a child, dies today from hunger, that's preventable. And in Yemen's case is human caused because of the war. I'm angry that I can wake up in a world today where, as we see in the film, a 6-year-old weighs 15 pounds. We as a global community have the resources to make sure that doesn't happen, but we haven't had the will. And my hope is that through the film, through the images in the film, through the storytelling, we can sort of galvanize that will to change the global status quo on the war. I'm a big believer that there's no such thing as a Democratic child or a Republican child or a Sunni child or a Shiite child. There's only a child, right? Mm. And we should all care about the fact that any child anywhere in the world dies from hunger when it doesn't have to happen, and especially when our own government is complicit in the conflict that allows that to occur.
This film tells such a powerful story that is really touches our hearts, and I think the very core of what's important to us. And so thank you for sharing that, because it does draw out compassion. And I want to turn now to Dr. Aisha Juman, who is the head of the Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation. She's actually the president, and she does a lot of work in Yemen. Dr. Juman, talk to us a little bit about your response to the film and the context of President Biden's recent order to stop the offensive in Yemen. What will that mean for actually the children who are suffering from famine or extreme hunger?
Thank you, Diane, and thank you, Sky, as well. I'm an epidemiologist by training, and which means if we talk about a lot of numbers, we always present number of deaths, number of sick, number. But this movie made those numbers come alive. People saw what it means to say someone is malnourished. We say there are, 2.3 million children in Yemen today who are suffering from hunger. A lot of people don't comprehend what that means. The movie made people realize what it means, the emotions, the agony that the families of these children suffer, the heartaches that they go through. And so this movie, for me especially, because a lot of the people in the movies look like my neighbors in Yemen, look like my relatives in Yemen, look like people I've sat with and ate with. And it's very challenging. It's extremely emotional for me to see that. And it is emotional because I am a Yemeni American, and our government has helped create this. When they decided to support the war on Yemen because they wanted to appease the Saudi over the Iran deal, nobody ever thought about how the Yemeni population is going to be affected, as if they didn't matter, as if they were not part of the equation. So to try and appease the dictator when the impact is going to be so great on so many millions of people, it's just very hard for me to comprehend. I am very happy with the announcement that President Biden had made, but every day that passes with the blockade on Yemen, with the war still going on in Yemen, every day more people die. According to UN recent statistics, 400,000 Yemeni children under 5 are starving or being starved to death, actually, not starving, but are being starved. These kids will die within a matter of weeks or months. And the longer we wait to end our complicity in this war, we have to risk the death of 400,000 people with the agony of the parents who are going through that. I'm reminded actually of the story of Moses when his mom was asked to put the baby in the river. In the Quran, it says her heart became void. That's the horror of putting your child away and not knowing what's going to happen to that child. Think about the parents in Yemen who know their children are going to die, yet they don't have any means of helping that child survive.
Mm-hmm. So, can you say just a little bit more? I mean, we are going to talk a little bit more about aid and where we are globally in trying to get aid to Yemen, because I know that the viewers are compelled to try to do something. But I think you've made it clear that the conflict, the war that's being perpetrated, is really driving the humanitarian crisis. Tell us a little bit more about the conflict. I mean, you mentioned it, and we talked earlier that it's a proxy war, but how has it affected people that people that you're related to? What is happening to the everyday lives of people in Yemen?
So the conflict started as a local conflict, like many internal conflicts. And on the eve of all the parties in Yemen agreeing to have a unity government that was inclusive of all the parties that were in conflict, the Saudis started bombing Yemen. Actually, there's a new publication by Jamal bin Omar, the previous UN envoy to Yemen, in which he said, and I remember that vividly, he said that he was already contacting the Saudi to decide with them where this unity government agreement was going to be signed. There was discussion about having it being signed in Riyadh. 2 days later, after all the Yemenis agreed to have a unity government, the Saudis started bombing to Yemen. According to bin Omar, also in his recent publication, he said that he watched in horror as the oldest city in the world was being bombed. And so that's basically what happened. In terms of how I was affected quite a bit, actually. My family lives in Yemen, in Sana'a, and in other parts of Yemen as well. Where they live, their neighborhood was bombed every single day.
Hmm.
I just bomb in Yemen hit that neighborhood. I couldn't sleep well for months because I was afraid if I slept, I'd wake up the next morning and call Yemen and my parents' home would not exist. It would not be there. We do have relatives. There were three girls and their brother. They were married and they had their own children. They had built for themselves a building in which 4 apartments. They were living in that apartments. The Saudi airstrikes were indiscriminate. They hit their building, and every single member in that family, 4 families, died, except one who was visiting my nephew. I, I heard about it from the news because my family did not want to tell me. They've been, my family owns chicken hatcheries. They bombed both the chicken hatcheries that my family owned. And, destruction of something like this is not as important as human life, but that's a source of food for Yemen. There was purposeful targeting of food products, producers in Yemen. Our in-laws had a cattle farm in Hodeidah. That also was destroyed. So everything that could sustain a population that was already experiencing famine and is under a blockade was targeted. So we've been really affected quite a bit by it. And the thing is, we are the privileged ones. We are the ones, despite all of that losses, we're still okay. Compare that to the millions of Yemeni who've lost everything. We have 4 million people who are internally displaced in Yemen today. They've lost everything, literally everything. So I want people to remember that my stories represent the stories of those privileged, not of those who are suffering, see their kids dying.
I'm so sorry for the losses, for your loss, and I thank you for sharing your own story with us because it does make it more real to us to recognize that. I want to turn to the scene in Washington, D.C., and to ask Hassan a question. Hassan and I work together at the Friends Committee on National Legislation, and our vision is to see a war free of war and a world free of war and the threat of war. And Hassan is providing a lot of leadership to lobby Congress to not only permanently end support to the Saudis and UAE, but also to address the need for development and aid to Yemen. So Hassan, talk about what's happening today. I know that today that FCNL, along with 60 other organizations, asked President Biden to immediately restore the US aid to Yemen, and that there will be an international pledging conference coming up shortly on March 1st. Tell us a little bit more about the letter and what's happening with the conference, and is there anything that we can do as ordinary people in this country to respond to that?
Thank you so much, Diane. And Aisha, it's always amazing to hear you, and it's just so powerful. And I'm so glad to call you a friend. And Sky, I'm just really excited for your film and all the people you're touching right now, and exposing so many people to this tragedy that's happening. And it's invaluable. So I think the last time we did a panel, a similar one, so many things happened on the same day. We got the announcement that the Biden administration was going to be ending U.S. support for offensive operations in the Saudi UAE-led war in Yemen. Well, today is another pretty significant day. We sent, it was actually 100 groups were sent a letter to the Biden administration calling on them to restore humanitarian assistance to all parts of Yemen. Now, just a little bit of history on that. In March 2020, at the start of the pandemic, the former Trump administration made a disastrous decision to suspend humanitarian aid, USAID funding, 73 million to northern Yemen, where 80% of the population lives. And this is really critical because it occurred alongside funding cuts to the UN, massive cuts to the UN, World Food Program, and the WHO. So it wasn't just USAID cuts, it was all sorts of programming was slashed right at a time where Yemen needed it the most. And 16 million people are living on the brink of famine right now in Yemen. And the acute malnutrition, the UN says it's 2.3 million children under 5. So this is a really critical thing. Now, Biden has made some really important policy resets on, ending support for offensive operations, pausing the weapon sales, and lifting an FTO designation that would label the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization, which would have really disrupted humanitarian aid operations. But the thing that they haven't done yet is restore this humanitarian funding. And it's critical not just because we need the 73 million that was suspended, but it also sends an important signal right before the UN donor conference. As the UN is trying to raise $3.82 billion. And last year they were short 1.9, and they dramatically cut a lot of programming. So we need to be able to, restore this humanitarian aid and make sure that this donor conference gets all the resources Yemen needs. Now, what we should do, we had this great advocacy letter. There are members of Congress speaking out. And there's another letter that's going to be released shortly by Chairman Deutsch from the House Foreign Affairs Committee. So that's great. But we need to reach out to our members of Congress and have them prioritize this. And I see that Michael put a link in the chat, and that's the FCNL action link that will allow you to be able to message your members of Congress and say that they should call on the Biden administration to immediately restore aid.
That's great. We always, every time we do an event at the Friends Committee, we definitely like to ask people to take action, and just to tell you that it does make a difference. And the reason we got Congressman Smith to come on in a little bit is because Aisha asked him to, and has been working with his office. And so it does make a difference to reach out and to work with your members of Congress and talk to them about this. Before, we have a couple questions coming up in the chat, and the congressman should be with us in just a few minutes. But before we turn to that, I want to ask our panelists if they want to ask questions of each other. And Sky, I'm going to turn it back to you and let you ask the question.
Yeah, great. I'm going to go to Aisha first then. Aisha, on top of sort of the misery of war, COVID-19 has just layered a whole another set of challenges on sort of the civilian population of Yemen. We're doing a very small scale work with the clinic and the hospital that we show in the film, just to support some of their efforts in lieu of the humanitarian funding that they didn't get the latter half of last year. Can you talk a little bit about what your foundation is doing now to sort of offset the dual challenges of both the war and COVID?
Thank you, Sky. I'd like to first to say a little bit about COVID-19 in Yemen. Yemen has the highest COVID-19 fatality rate in the world, at 28%. In all of Yemen, new cemeteries had to be opened because the old cemeteries were filled with people who died of COVID-19. In the first few months, over 110 health professionals died due to COVID-19. When COVID-19 hit Yemen, they had nothing. They did not have PPEs. They did not have even reagents to test people for COVID-19. So Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation was actually the first organization in all of Yemen, including UN organization, to send COVID-19 reagents that was donated by the Robert Koch Institute in Berlin. We were able to distribute masks. We were able to outfit health centers in Yemen that treat COVID-19 with most of their needs to protect the healthcare workers who were working on that. We also partnered with a lot of Yemeni diaspora in terms of providing training to healthcare workers of how to protect themselves. We also put in a lot of information to the community in Arabic using relevant and culturally acceptable information out. So these are some of the things we did. But one of the things that was actually quite surprising in a way, we didn't think of it in the midst of all that was going on, is that people, when there was a survey that was done and asked people what was their major concern about COVID-19, over 79% of the population that was surveyed said food security was the biggest concern. People could not stay home like we did. And actually, a lot of people in the US also who live on daily wages could not stay home. And if they stayed home, that meant they would go hungry. When we distributed a lot of food baskets because we wanted people to stay home, especially early on during the outbreak, and families were telling us, they said, we would rather die of COVID-19 than of hunger because it's faster to die of COVID-19. That was their response.
That's powerful. Hassan, do you want to take a question to ask someone?
Absolutely. I'd like to ask a question of Sky. Sky, what were key messages you heard from Yemeni people when you were filming this documentary?
That's a great question, Hassan, and it's a question that we discussed a lot with our colleagues in country and the collaborators on the project. And there was really one clear messaging that echoed over and over again, and it was basically that the challenges of the war could be overcome if one thing happened, and that was that as soon as foreign powers stopped military intervention and support, then and exited the conflict fully, then they could sort of go to work to rebuild the country. As soon as fighter jets stopped raining precision guided munitions down on non-military targets, they could get to work. As soon as civilian flights, right, were restored to the north of the country and free access to and from the country was restored, they could get to work. As soon as the UAE withdrew from Socotra, right, and pulled military advisors out of the country and intelligence advisors out of the country, they could start to operate freely again. But none of that has verifiably occurred as of today. But when it does, what we heard over and over again was that they have the capacity and the will to internally rebuild, and that includes their own government.
Thank you so much.
And I do have a question for you. What do you see is coming from Capitol Hill in the coming weeks? What can ordinary people do to help bring this up as a priority issue?
Thank you for that really important question. One, I definitely think calling on our members of Congress right now to restore humanitarian aid is a great short-term action step. Like Sky mentioned, like you mentioned, Aisha, there's a lot that needs to happen, but this is something that we can do right now, is just restore this humanitarian funding to all parts of Yemen and make sure that, that this critical care is delivered. Beyond that, though, there's still a lot. The House Foreign Affairs Committee is going to be doing a hearing on the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, so we'll be watching for that. There's a letter that was just released today by Representative Rokana and Representative DeFazio asking the Biden administration really important questions about what does this policy reset actually entail? What is the difference between offensive and defensive? What are the impacts of the blockade? And just other questions like that. So I think that's also really important. Last thing I'll mention is that, I think it's really critical. Obviously, the executive branch does its thing with ending support for the war, but I think Congress really needs to, make its voice heard in the National Defense Authorization Act and DoD appropriations, the Defense Appropriations Bill, to also have oversight over what we're doing in the war in Yemen and making sure that, they're part of the conversation as well. Speaking of Congress.
Thank you so much to the panelists for your questions and responses to each other. And I'm really pleased that Congressman Adam Smith has joined us today, who is the chair of the House Armed Services Committee, a very important role that helps make some of these decisions. Chairman Smith, we just want to thank you for your leadership in efforts to end the war, in the U.S. support to the Saudi Arabia and UAE. And I'm going to turn it over to our panelists who would like, first of all, I want to turn it over to you and let you make some remarks, and then each of our panelists would like to ask a question. So thank you so much for joining us, and please give us some words of wisdom.
That's a lot of pressure in that introduction there. I will do my best. And actually, there are a couple things I think we can do. I mean, my goal here is not just in the U.S. involvement. My goal is to build an international consensus to address the humanitarian crisis. I mean, if the U.S. is just out of it and, you know, the incredible humanitarian crisis goes merrily on, then I don't consider that to be a huge victory. There's work we can do here to bring coalition partners together, get to a peaceful solution and move forward. And, you know, certainly I think part of this is Congress putting pressure on Saudi Arabia, because job one here is to get a peace agreement. And look, at this point, Saudi Arabia has lost. Not to put it in sort of a zero-sum sort of way here, but whatever it is they thought they were going to accomplish in Yemen, they are not going to accomplish. They have strengthened the Houthis, both in terms of territory and in terms of influence. And, you know, we need to work very closely with Saudi Arabia and, you know, work with UAE and others to put pressure on them to get to the peace table and accept an agreement here. They're in a very, you know, awkward position, you know, I mean, that a lot of countries get into, where you stumble into something that's not going well, but oh my gosh, we can't leave now and admit failure. We need to pile on to the failure and make it even worse. So, you know, we need to find whatever leverage points we can to convince Saudi Arabia to change that. And, you know, I think that's crucially important. The other thing is to really work with the aid groups on the ground to build up, how to put this exactly, to make sure that the aid's working. And, you know, that's UAE's big argument. And I've had this conversation with them many times. You know, I forget the exact dollar figure, but they talk about a lot of money that's been poured into Aden in particular. And if you walk around there, you can't really see it. So we need to convince them, and I'm not saying that's correct. I'm saying that is their position, is that the aid has not had the positive effect they would like, and they would like to find some place to give that aid that will result in humanitarian improvements. So got to get a peace agreement, and got to build up confidence that the aid pipeline is working. I happen to think, and I've seen and talked to a number of people, that there are a lot of places where it is working. So we need to make that case and get people to make that investment. In terms of Congress's role, I want to try to put pressure on those two things. And then also, you know, build off of some of the language. We haven't gotten the exact language we've wanted in previous years, but we have pulled the U.S. in cooperation now with President Biden, you know, to, you know, no longer offer air refueling. Various other logistical supports. We've pulled back that support. And I think, you know, part of that is putting pressure on Saudi Arabia to reach that peace agreement. So, I mean, that's what we're trying to do. And this continues to be a huge priority for me and for the committee. So I look forward to your questions.
Congressman, thank you very much for joining us today. I'm actually proud to call you my representative in the state of Washington.
Good to see you, Ashia.
Your leadership has meant a lot to me and to my family in Yemen, and to many Yemeni American as well. So I know that there's a conference for donors that had been called by Sweden and Switzerland that's happening this Monday. And I'd like to ask about what Congress may be able to do to support that conference and ensure that people actually do pledge, but also when they pledge, they do give money. Because last year, for example, the Saudi pledged, but they didn't, fulfill their promise. And the Emirates pledged zero. So I'm hoping that Congress can help us ensure that there is adequate funding this year.
Yeah, two big things we can do. One, obviously, participate in that conference, and two, provide money. And the things we're not talking about a lot of money here, U.S. is involved in aid in many places across the world, and we've been pulling back from doing as much in Yemen as we should. If we put some money up, that encourages others, and that's the simple, straightforward thing we can do. And I get into the ins and outs of what we can do congressionally to advocate for that. And then we should advocate with our international partners to provide those resources to help. But lead by example. Have the U.S. be a leader in doing that, and we're going to aggressively push to get that money.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Chairman. Really appreciate that answer and you joining us today. And I want to second what Aisha said. Your leadership on a lot of this has been really critical. Your support for the Yemen War Powers Resolution, provisions through the National Defense Authorization Act to really look at any U.S. participation in the Saudi UAE blockade of Yemen. And that's what I wanted to talk about because, aid's really critical, but the blockade is also playing a really negative impact on the humanitarian crisis. So, the Biden administration said we're ending U.S. military support for offensive operations and weapon sales. But do we know if any U.S. participation in the blockade is included in that reset? And what can you do as chairman of the House Armed Services Committee to probe any U.S. involvement in the blockade? And what can members of Congress and advocates do to support you in that?
Yeah, I have been told that there is no U.S. support for the blockade. What we can do is make sure that is true and enforce it. But yeah, no, that is not something we should be participating in. That would clearly fall under the category of an offensive action. So we'll follow up with the National Security Council with Biden folks, make sure that we're not offering support that. And then, as I said, crucially, whether we're supporting it or not, let's try to find a way to end it. Let's try to get to a peace agreement. And part of this that I didn't mention earlier is, right now you've got the Houthis lobbing missiles into Saudi Arabia, understandably so, because they're defending themselves. But then it becomes sort of a cycle of violence. So that's why the peace part of this is so great, because I can guarantee you when we go to the Saudis and say, hey, you got to knock this off, they're going to say, okay, well, what do we do when missiles are coming into our country? And that's why getting everybody involved here is crucial to getting to a peace agreement, to end the blockade and to end the fight. And as you well know, even if we end the fight, there's still a ton of work to do on economic, all kinds of challenges and problems there. But that's step one to me, is get to that peace agreement.
Thank you, Chairman. I have one more question. I know that your office talks to the Saudis and the Emiratis, like many other offices. How do we work with them to ensure that they pay their fair share to the humanitarian response in Yemen?
Yeah, I talk to the Emiratis more than I talk to the Saudis, for obvious reasons. I have met with the Saudi ambassador. I think there's a real opportunity there. And coming out of the Abraham Accords, the UAE wants to build a different Middle East. They are concerned about Iran, but they are also concerned about Sunni extremism. And they are concerned about the legitimacy of their regime and the legitimacy of the Saudi regime, too, for that matter. As it becomes, an autocrat, well, it is an autocratic government that's not delivering for the people, they understand the vulnerability there. They want to build a more peaceful future. And I think we should seize on that. And I think we should work with them. And I've told them, straight up, you want us to have a better relationship. You want to be able to, buy weapon systems from us and help with Iran. Just as soon as there's peace in Yemen, you're going to find that a heck of a lot easier to do. And that incentivizes them to use the levers that they have. And, UAE in particular has a lot of influence in the region. They have a lot of influence in Yemen. They have a lot of relationships, particularly in the south. It's wrong to say that they have, influence over Saudi Arabia, but they have more than we do. MBS is a huge problem. And I did a trip to the Middle East year ago, November now, met with King Hussein, Jordan, King Abdullah, mind freeze there, and they're all aware of the problem, that, we've got, a young, impetuous leader in Saudi Arabia who's trying to do a lot, but he's made some pretty serious missteps in the short term. And Saudi Arabia is not going to be able to accomplish what they're trying to accomplish unless they change that. And I think we should bring all of those forces together and continue the dialogue with UAE. Now, I mean, it's tough. I mean, the perfect being the enemy of the good. I mean, UAE they're an autocratic government. They've got the issue, they got challenges, and we can say, okay, so you've done this, but you haven't done that. What are we going to do about, the killing of Khashoggi? And we have to calculate that. And I'll tell you again, my calculation is very straightforward. You help us bring peace to Yemen, then we got a whole lot of room to talk about the other stuff. And that is what I think we ought to be doing. Now, that other stuff is going to, they did finally work things out with Qatar, but there's a lot of conflict in that region, to be sure. But I think that's a starting point. And I will tell you that they are eager to accomplish that. But there are the other things that get in the way. So we're trying to push past those other things, get to the accomplishment. But I think your question is incredibly important. This doesn't happen if we don't find some way to get the UAE and Saudi Arabia to be willing to do it. They are just critical to what we're talking about here. We can't just push them away and tell them they're bad and walk away. We've got to find a way to bring everybody involved to get to some, at least interim steps to reduce the conflict and move towards humanitarian solutions.
Thank you for that, Congressman. That's very helpful, I think, to all of us to hear your stance on that. I'd like to ask you just a brief question about military advisors in Riyadh. Your position as chairman of the House Armed Services Committee is a unique one, and I realize that a lot of information is classified, but I hope you can address a piece of this at least, and that's that, it's well reported that over the years during the course of this conflict, there have been U.S. military oversight advisors in the targeting room in Riyadh with limited success, shall we say. With the Biden administration's pivot with the language of no longer supporting offensive operations, do you know what the Biden administration's stance is if Saudi Arabia now continues offensive operations, especially on non-military targets unilaterally? Is there a plan in place for some sort of robust action on the part of the U.S. to escalate our response?
Yeah, the short answer is no. There's not a plan in place for that. Now, we have the other part of this, which we haven't talked about, and we've talked about it before, but we haven't talked about it tonight. Is there's AQAP is very active in, I guess that would be Eastern Yemen. And we have had ongoing relationships with the UAE and others doing offensive operations against them, which is kind of, well, nothing's really totally separate, but it is somewhat separate from the civil war itself. The other piece, of course, is in 2015 when the Obama administration made the decision that if Saudi Arabia was going to do this, it would be better to have us, guiding them. It's impossible to know for sure whether or not it was better than what, better than a hypothetical, but your assessment is spot on. It certainly wasn't effective. The bombing hit many civilian targets, exacerbated the humanitarian crisis, and they really didn't work out, which is, why Biden administration and why we in Congress, had pressured them for a long time to end that. And now President Biden has decided to end that. Now, if Saudi Arabia, continues to, bomb, cause problems, and what are our options? What pressure can we put on them to change their approach? Certainly up front, suspending any arms sales to them is, something that Congress is supportive. As you probably know, the Trump administration on the way out the door, the many fun-filled things that they did, they approved, massive number of arms sales to Saudi Arabia, which we're now trying to reverse. So that would be the biggest one. And then, economic sanctions, or there are all kinds of different tools. But again, the other thing we're trying to make sure that Saudi Arabia doesn't get completely taken over by violent extremists. How do we balance that? And I think right now the Biden administration is trying to answer that question. So I will end my answer here with a slightly more optimistic note than I started it with. Even though there's not a plan in place, they are trying to put that plan in place. And the Khashoggi murder is part of this as well, because as you know, there's a report there that we're trying to get declassified so that people can see it. And I think the Biden administration is keenly aware that once that comes out, then that puts a lot of pressure on us to take some action to, I don't know, punish Saudi Arabia. It's always so difficult. I think there tends to be an assumption that, the United States of America, we can just, slap people with sanctions or do something and force them to change. It doesn't work that well or that seamlessly. But my opinion is you have to draw the line. And even if the purpose of sanctions, the purpose of some sort of diplomatic rapprochement or whatever it is we do, even if that doesn't, completely change the behavior and solve the problem, to not do it is to give sort of passive acceptance. And you have to decide what you cannot passively accept. And I think MBS's decision to murder Khashoggi, and I think the way they've conducted the war in Yemen, are things that we should not passively accept. What the precise response is, that's a tougher question to answer, but that's one that the Biden folks are right now, I think, trying putting together an answer. They are not going to take the same hands-off approach to this that the Trump folks did. I know that.
That's heartening to hear. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. I'm going to let Hassan ask one last question, and because I know we're about out of time here.
Yeah, thank you so much. So you've been talking a lot about diplomacy, and that's what I would like to get to in my question here. The original UN Security Council resolution that was passed on Yemen was really kind of pro-Hadi government and anti-Houthi. It was saying we had to cut off weapons to the Houthis and put a lot of pressure on them. Now, over time, it's we've seen that there's bad people on both sides, and you've said that pretty well here in this discussion. Senator Murphy, in the nomination hearing of Linda Thomas Greenfield, said that there might be a need to have a new UN Security Council resolution that's more balanced, that says the entire international community should stop selling weapons to all the warring parties, that the blockade should end, that we should call for a nationwide ceasefire and end to humanitarian obstruction, from all sides. And I'm wondering, is that something that the House Armed Services Committee has thought about, and is that something that you'd be willing to support as we look to find more balanced approach to diplomacy in Yemen?
I would certainly look at the details of that. I mean, there's no question that step needs to be taken, and also the whole facts on the ground cliche. At the time that the UN did that, the Hadi government was considered to be the legitimate government of Yemen. Whatever passes for legitimacy these days, but there had been when Saleh stepped aside, Hadi was so the Houthis were viewed as, trying to overthrow a legitimate government, and the UN frowns upon that, as well they should. But the situation now is, the Houthis control far more territory than the Hadi government. Hadi's still hanging out in Riyadh or whatever. He's not even really part of it. The situation has changed. I think the UN resolution should recognize that to go for a more balanced approach. And I don't know the ins and outs of this, but the key to this is to find people within the Houthis who you can really negotiate with at this point, and work with. They've got the power, got to figure out how to get to a reasonable outcome. And so absolutely, the UN resolution needs to be revisited because it does not reflect the current government of Yemen by any stretch.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Congressman Smith, for joining us tonight. It's really it's encouraging to hear your approach to peace, your approach to diplomacy, and your leadership of this important committee, but also as a member in Congress. And we want to work with you. I'm going to give Hassan
Can Casey, just one thing in parting, there is cause for a great deal of optimism here. It is very difficult to overstate how problematic the Trump administration was. And I'm not just talking about, crazy tweets or whatever. They gutted the ability of the federal government in a wide variety of places, but certainly in the State Department. And the National Security Council. I mean, it became, a sycophantic, organization, designed to more feed Trump's ego than to actually do their job. So to have Biden and this team in there now, we have tools at our disposal. So I'm much more optimistic about it. Thank you. Appreciate that.
New day in Washington and a new day for the world, that's for sure. So Hassan, you want to do the call to action, and then I want to turn it over to Sky to have the last word for the call to how to share this film even more widely.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciated this discussion. I think it's really important right now, in advance of the March 1 donor summit, that we let our members of Congress know that the Biden administration should restore aid to all parts of Yemen. And I urge folks to go to visit fcnl.org/hunger ward to find the action link. And I think Michael put it in the chat here. So I would definitely encourage people, let their members of Congress know that it's time to restore aid to the country.
Yeah, and there's a lot of resources on the Hunger Ward website, hungerward.org, that link to both the Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Fund, the YAC, the Yemeni Alliance Committee, FCNL, and then some of our small efforts to support the clinics that you saw in the film. And then more broadly, the Hunger Ward is launching for public consumption, shall we say, on Monday on Pluto TV, and will be available to anyone who's using that platform. It currently has a user base of 36 million globally. So pass the word, and those who haven't seen the film can watch it for free on Pluto TV Monday night.
Thank you, Aisha, for participating in this. Thank you, Hassan, for your advocacy and tonight. And Sky, thank you for making this incredible film. And we will look forward to sharing it as widely as possible. And we will look forward to peace and an end to this humanitarian crisis.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you all.
Have a great night, everybody.